Okay, maybe we'll get started then. We'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is called Why I Might Choose to Participate in Research. This webinar series is part of our funded research demonstration grant called the Overlap Study, which is a study of patients who are diagnosed with sleep apnea and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and who are prescribed CPAP therapy. As a research demonstration grant, we're putting together a series of webinars that are focused on issues related to the research that we're conducting. One component of that is promoting patient and stakeholder engagement in research. Our research team has found that one of the issues that came up quite a bit during our discussions is the question, well, why should I participate in research at all? Thought we would put down some of our thoughts and have a discussion on this topic. The webinar is presented by the American Sleep Apnea Association, and we work together with the COPD Foundation on the overlap research. Next slide, please. I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping issues. First, this recording will be recorded for future use, and we'll share it with the PCORNet Commons, which is a shared resource center for the National Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network. We're planning for the presentation to be about 20 minutes in length. We'll have questions and answers at the end, and we'll open it up for discussion afterwards. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button called Q&A, and you can enter questions there. Once we open it up for discussion, if you raise your hand, Sean can unmute you so we can hear you talk. We'll try to avoid unmuting everyone so we don't have extra noise in the background. Slide 3, please, next one. Our speakers for today are Will Hedepol, Hugo Campos, and Adam Amder. My name is Carl Stepnowski, and I'm a research health scientist at the San Diego, Associate Professor of Medicine at UCSD, Chief Science Officer at the American Sleep Apnea Association, and Principal Investigator on the Overlap Study. Will?
Hi, Will Hedepol here. I'm an OSA patient, probably since I was a small child, but didn't realize it until I was probably in my 40s and got diagnosed, which is a similar problem that a lot of people have when they're diagnosed late. And I'm also on the board of the American Sleep Apnea Association.
Hugo?
Hi everyone, and I'm Hugo Campos. I'm a person living with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a type of genetic heart muscle disease. I'm also a caregiver to a parent living with congestive heart failure, and I am involved in a number of projects as sort of a stakeholder, PCORI funded, or a part of a CDRN, that's a clinical data research network that's part of PCORNet, called PScanner, and I'm also participant representative for the California Precision Medicine Consortium, which is part of the All of Us program that launches this coming May and June. On Sunday. I guess I need more coffee.
Yes, it's a good webinar you chose to be. It's a good webinar you chose to be on, Hugo. The fact that you need coffee is telling, huh?
It's true.
So I'm Adam Amder. I'm the Chief Patient Officer of the American Sleep Apnea Association. I've been treated for about 10 years. I've had apnea in hindsight probably since I was about 2 years old. We diagnosed my daughter at 2. She's now 10. And happy to be working with Hugo, Carl, and Will about why we've all navigated this PCORI road for the last 5 years and what we've learned along the way, and what we really want to communicate back to our audiences about why we think the individuals that we come across through every day want to participate in research. So I'm looking forward to having an open conversation and not a one direction. So I think we could have a nice conversation and open it up to the public that's with us, and see what else we can figure out along this journey. So thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yep. Thanks, Sean. Next slide. This slide shows the goals for our webinar today. First, we'd like to provide some basic educational information about the role of research in helping us generate new knowledge that can help inform clinical practice. And in some of our ASAA-sponsored research, we found that 70 to 75% of people in our community have never participated in research before at all. So we thought it might be important to help provide some brief background on research participation. Second, we'd like to present a personalized motivational framework for study participation so that folks can understand a variety of reasons for why people might participate in research studies. And quite frankly, we'll probably cover why people don't participate in research studies too. And finally, we'd like to have this webinar be a resource that can be used by the National Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Network to help researchers better understand the patient perspective when it comes to research participation. Next slide. And just to provide some background on PCORI, which stands for the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, they're the main funder of some great research that's been funded over the last 6 to 7 years. They've had a very positive influence on incorporating the patient perspective into the research process. I can honestly say, since I've been involved in research since the late 1990s, early 2000s, it's very rare for an agency to have this perspective and to have as much influence as they've had. So we want to emphasize this point from the About Us section of the PCORI website, which shows that PCORI is focused on producing and promoting high integrity evidence-based information that comes from research that's guided by patients, by caregivers, and by the broader healthcare community. And I think research can really benefit from including these folks into the research process. Related to this point is the concept of the idea of patient-centeredness in general, which PCORI defines as patient-governed, patient-informed, and patient-driven, all in an effort to create more transparent relationships within the research that accurately reflects patient interests and builds trust for efficient long-term access to patient data. Patient stakeholders provide input from not just the beginning of the research in terms of research design and focus and main goals, but during the conduct of the research project to make sure that it's going in the way that they would like. They're instrumental in helping to recruit and promote the word and help get folks interested in the research. And then all the way through dissemination or spreading the word about the findings of the research project and why the findings might be important and how they might impact medical practice. So we're really lucky to have 3 of the leading patient researchers in the country with us today, and each has been involved in a variety of research studies in a variety of roles. So we're really fortunate to have these 3 with us. Next slide. As we kick off the main portion of the webinar, just wanted to provide you with a very brief synopsis of the main points we'd like to make today. First, provide a very brief overview of research in general and why it's important. And then second, we'll discuss what's in it for you when you participate in research. Next slide. In a nutshell, medicine really can't advance without scientific data. This is how new information is generated and how scientific advancements are made. In fact, when a new medical device or drug is being evaluated by the FDA, it's a requirement that studies are done to show that the devices and drugs are safe and that they do what is claimed. It's only through well-designed and well-executed research studies that we can have reliable and valid data that we can rely on to make decisions about whether to approve or not approve these drugs and devices. And that really just represents one type of research approach. There's a wide variety of research studies and goals. One example of what I was just doing yesterday as we're putting together a research proposal within the ASAA is we were interested in looking at what the research literature has to say about 2 relatively new therapies for sleep apnea. One's hypoglossal nerve stimulation and one's oral myofunctional therapy. Did a literature search on both within the last couple of days, and on the nerve stimulation, there's about 80 studies in the literature, and on oral myofunctional therapy, there's about 30 to 40 studies, with some as early as the 1970s. Now our job is to go through those studies, find what's most relevant so we can make a determination about which studies to include in our research grant, which is focused on studying the benefits and side effects of therapies that are prescribed for patients who are diagnosed with mild to moderate sleep apnea. And we really want this research project to be from the patient perspective. So it's just an example of it's only through research participation that we can go to the medical literature and look at the studies that can help us determine how how strong or not strong the evidence is. That examples from the research perspective, because my day job is focused on writing grants and running research studies, but when you go see your physician, how they practice medicine is largely influenced by the studies that are published in the medical literature. So in no small way, you and all of us are benefiting from study participation of folks before you. And without your study participation today and going forward, our family, our friends, and our communities won't benefit tomorrow. So we could spend an entire webinar, even a whole day, talking about the details of research projects, but suffice it to say there's a wide variety of research studies, and we could make that the topic of a future webinar. But let's get to the main goal of this webinar, which is to talk about why participate in research. With that brief background, I'll hand it over to Will in the next slide.
So we tried to come up with something that we could think of as a simple and easy to understand framework for what's in it for me, because at the end of the day, that's what most people think about when they're coming up with whether they want to participate or not. And we came up with, we think there's three motivators or three kind of classes. One's the self-benefit class, which we'll define in a minute. And then self-understanding, you know, what can I learn about myself by participating in research? And then there's the altruistic selflessness concept where you don't get much out of it, but you know that other people do. Next slide. So in the self-benefit, it's kind of like, well, what will your volunteering result in, you know, benefit to you? And some of these studies that people participate, they do get remuneration, either money or other things. And then also you get something by researching, by being part of the research, like, you know, you can claim it as a resume item, that kind of stuff. So I wanted to open up a little bit and get some thoughts. Maybe I'll start with Hugo on the self-benefit side.
Right. So, you know, I always think about why I participate in research, and I think for the majority of folks and out there, and I don't know how it is for people participating, is if you think about yourself, why would you participate in research? A lot of times, I think essentially the motivator is what Carl was explaining, which is the spirit of altruism, really sort of helping advance science or discover a cure or improve a treatment, provide information to researchers and scientists. But that's really sort of not really my key motivator, or to participating in research as a human subject, as it's called in research. My real interest is usually access, and it really is either access to doctors, access to second opinions, access to tests that I would otherwise not have access to. Many years ago, and I know that's not really the purpose of research. It's not really to provide medical care, but there are benefits in my view, and this is usually how kind of I approach it. There are benefits for participating in research in terms of like learning from if you do have interactions and have access to the research team, learning from the research team and learning from the folks whom you're interacting with more about a specific condition. Like in my case, I like to sign up for studies about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy because I have access to the clinicians, to the researchers who specialize in researching the condition. Echocardiograms are a great value to me, and I participated in a study for a new drug on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It was specifically designed for HCM patients, and in fact, the trial was stopped because it was deemed to be unsafe in some aspects. I think it's the right term. And folks were within implantable, not to go too deep into it. People were getting arrhythmias, and so the study was stopped. But luckily I wasn't one of the people observing.
Lucky for us all, Hugo.
but my point is, like, I for the course of almost like a year, I had access to echocardiograms and EKG tests, all of these tests that I was able to collect and track, and to me that's great value. Also, the clinical visits with the researchers were opportunities for me to ask questions. So the altruism, to me, it's kind of a component, is kind of the icing on the cake. It's wonderful that I'm helping to advance science, but I approach it in some weird kind of ways. I'm kind of hesitant to admit in a sort of, I approach it in a slightly kind of selfish way of what can I get from this interaction.
It's all about really what's in it for me, and that's kind of what motivates lots of people to be involved in this kind of thing. So maybe we'll go to the next slide, and then Adam, I'm going to ask you to chime in and talk about the self-understanding part and some of the studies you've been involved in.
So, coming from our cohort, which is primarily a cognitively impaired, sleep-deprived, long-term soft disease. We're not the heart failure like Hugo deals with, or some of our AFib fellow colleagues, or some of the type 1 diabetes patients. It's been it's enabled me to do as I put on my mask first, which is what they tell you on an airplane before you help others around you. And we just saw in a recent airplane incident that most people didn't even know how to put on their mask first, so which is telling of most common sort of cognitive capabilities of our general public walking through society today, knowing that we all need zombies, that we all are zombies, that we need our coffee. So with that being said, the understanding after the fact, once I started my treatment and then would get in front of my clinician or my allergist or my psychotherapist, whoever was that team member that I was meeting with to deal with, whether it was a comorbidity issue, a mental health issue, whatever it might have been, or dealing with my resupplies for my machine. I mean, we truly are looking to remove the obstructions in sleep apnea. We literally have a physical obstruction, whether it's in our airway, in our mouth, in our nose, and removing as many of those barriers is sort of my path to sort of self-understanding and burning away the fog, the brain fog, and sort of clarifying the perspective and view for what I need for myself, then for my immediate family, and then now as we're starting to help others around us with one, like for example, is, we launched our observational longitudinal sleep health study on the Apple platform. We're doing an overlap study with the COPD Foundation, looking at the overlaps between OSA and COPD. There's a lot of other overlaps that we want to start to look at. So it's getting that understanding and that knowledge, and then going back and working with Carl Stemnowski, our Chief Science Officer, and being able to it's sort of be in that co-pilot seat, whereas we're not in the back of the plane anymore, Hugo, and we can sort of we can bring the real world practical knowledge to the conversation, and Carl could sort of, helps guide us through what the traditional academic research world is. And I think together we're starting to really evolve and find a happy medium about really looking for outcomes that are beneficial to us and our fellow other chronic patients. I remember Manny Hernandez once said that, he goes, we can never get the chronic disease patients into studies because what do they need first? They need support. Give them the support, then we can get them into study and help them out in that regard. Whereas the rare disease are much more motivated because nobody knows who they even are, so they're fighting and clawing and scratching their way, to get into this stuff. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's what I've come to understand as far as about the role research has played in my evolution and our evolution as an organization in the last 4 or 5 year journey that we've been on.
Yeah, you mentioned the overlap study, which is COPD and obstructive sleep apnea study that's currently going on. And one of the nice things about that study is we collect information as researchers on a nightly basis from the CPAP machine, and then we can put it in a dashboard for the research participant to actually see how things are going. And with a little bit of coaching, different styles of coaching, they can potentially improve. So that'd be a great example of how you can understand a little bit more about your condition by being part of that kind of research. So I'll go to the next slide.
So we do have one question in the Q&A box that one of you guys might want to answer.
What is it?
It is, Elizabeth asked, as a patient, what part of research process have you found to be the most frustrating, and what part of research process have you enjoyed the most? Hugo, you want to answer that first?
Sure. I love that question. So thank you, Elizabeth. This is, you know what I think is most frustrating is this, when you sign up for research and you're really kind of excited about participating, and this has happened to me once, and you realize that as you're going in for clinic visits, and you realize that this is costing you more money to participate than you're getting anything out of it in terms of, I mean, it's like, it's one thing to sort of donate your time and donate your blood, donate your data to research. But it's another thing when you're doing all of these things and still you're actually paying money out of your own pocket in addition to the time that you're spending participating in research, but also putting money out of your pocket to drive to an academic center that's 45 minutes away, to park the car, to have lunch, or kill your entire day, sometimes the entire morning that you're not working because you're participating in research. And that's really frustrating. And I think a lot of times, and I think this is kind of a challenge, I think, a lot of times, because patients, I think from the researcher point of view, it's like you don't want to incentivize patients too much. You don't want to say, oh, here's $100 for participating in this research, because then folks may be participating only
biased.
Biased. But I think in a very least, a patient should be able to expense their send reports for their expenses, and it may be different for somebody who lives in the same neighborhood where the research is being conducted, or the visits they have to go in for the visits, or as opposed to somebody who lives an hour away and has to drive and take a big chunk of their day. And I think participants should be compensated for their time. So that's really what I think is the most frustrating. What's been most enjoyable for me has been whenever I have an opportunity to learn more about my condition, become a better patient, because to me it really translates as empowerment, right? So as somebody living with a chronic condition, or something that you're not going to fix, you really have to manage for the rest of your life, the more empowered, the more on top of it you become, the more empowered you become, the more knowledgeable you become about your condition, the more you learn how to navigate the healthcare system, how research works, the better off you are in getting from the healthcare system what you need to get to live a better quality of life, a healthier life, extend your life, whatever your goals might be.
Great. A couple other questions. How do people typically find out where and how to participate in research studies?
I think we have a slide at the end of our deck that has a link to the clinicaltrials.gov, to the PCORnet and PCORI main web page. I know we, and along with the COPD Foundation and a lot of other patient partners, are always offering information about the studies that we're conducting on our own websites.
Mm-hmm.
Carl, you might want to chime in on that.
Yeah, Clinical Trials is a great resource to go to. Generally, that's national, so sometimes it's hard to find stuff you can look for it by disease condition or treatment approach. But then local universities, local VA medical centers are usually good resources too.
Yeah, right. If I can add to that too, I think there are a lot of stuff on social media too. If you if you look and if you kind of find the groups for like your condition or the things that matter to you that you're interested in, and look for ways to engage that way, and follow the academic center near your home or near your area. Kind of engage in conversations, ask around, ask your doctor during a clinic visit.
I had a good conversation with a fellow friend of ours the other day, Hugo Gills Friedman, and we were talking to a cancer friend of mine who's got stage 4, and we asked him, he said, has your doctor seen other patients like you? And he has, rare male breast cancer, which only 1 in 1,400 in the country have. And when the doctor can't even say they've never even seen that kind of case before, that's when you have to ask yourself, you got to go find the person who actually is looking at this and specializes in that, and that's a cancer route. Yeah. But being your advocate and really looking for the right studies and look for who the true thought leaders are, and who's really promoting the study and what they're looking to get out of it, you have to ask those questions. I mean, you talked about earlier about compensation. I know Will and I, when we showed up to our first board meeting of a patient advocacy association 5 years ago, we were the first time 2 patients ever showed up, because the doctors are professionally paid to go to these events, to get continuing education, to participate, to have this stuff on their resumes, to keep their knowledge and their careers going. Whereas the patients, we never were able to show up before. And you have sort of a next generation that are getting treated with these chronic diseases, and where we're looking at our data. We need to understand what's going on. We don't have 3 months of lag window to wait to get an answer back from the clinical care system, or from the DME, whatever that obstruction is along the way, or that obstacle. It's real. It's, finding these resources, the internet, the social media, Dr. Google, they're all good. You just have to learn how to manage them the right way, I think.
Yeah.
And I want to just to add that to that, Adam, it's there are a couple of things I was going to say, and I lost my train of thought. But it's okay. I remember. So about compensation. So you mentioned compensation, and I mean, think about it in two separate buckets. It's reimbursement. It's sort of like the most basic thing. At least some participants should be reimbursed.
Absolutely.
I'm not even talking about compensation. Compensation is even like a step further. Being compensated for participating, that would be ideal. But reimbursement should be a given. Nobody should be paying to participate in research. Especially if it's driven by a pharmaceutical company who's sponsoring, or somebody who has got a way to pay, right? Or should have a way to pay. If it's an NIH funding, it may be a little harder, but if it's, all of us are collectively funding it as citizens, but it may be harder to get compensation, but reimbursement, I think, should be sort of where the bar should at least be.
The bare minimum should be reimbursement, and then covering caregiver cost, travel cost.
Yeah. So it kind of goes up from there, but I was thinking that it's very much like other industries. If you want to be more clinical about it, in the software business, you bring people in to help develop software products and that kind of thing, and you have to pay for them and pay for their time. But somehow the medical research has not been like that. That's part of why we're having this discussion today, because there's lots of motivations that will get people into research, and one of them is not to have to dig into their own pocket to be altruistic. That's like almost super altruistic. I'm gonna switch to the next slide, and I also want to recognize that Jeffrey has a question, and we'll take that in a minute. So if you think about the framework, the best studies are the studies that kind of hit all these different pieces in the Venn diagram. So you have some form of selflessness and altruistic wanting to progress science, but then you also get a little something out of it, like your data on a regular basis, so you can improve your outcome, and then the self-benefit. You also get paid for your time or your expenses. So a good research study, I think, has those three pieces kind of overlapping, and so sometimes they have to do it. They, meaning the researchers, because you can't get people into studies unless you make it attractive and you address the what's in it for me piece of the puzzle. And then others, maybe it's easy to subscribe for all the people who just they're all in the selflessness category, but usually it's some combination of those three. So let's go to the next slide. So here's the list of the different links that we think might be interesting to you. Next slide. All right, so now we're in the discussion and we'll get into the questions. I'd like to encourage anybody who doesn't know where that chat button or the Q&A button down below to go ahead and click on that. We'd love to hear from you. So Jeffrey's question is, have the research protocols done any work on patient engagement, especially if there is a treatment that is to be done day in and day out, and how compliant the patient is? Sounds like a question for Dr. Stepnowski.
Yeah, there sure have been studies on how to help people, especially if this is related to treatment adherence and how to use the therapy on a daily or nightly basis. This gets hard because it's getting at true behavior change, and sometimes we think that's really the rocket science of medicine because there's so many complex factors that are involved. Adam and I were just talking the other day, and about 10 years ago when I summarized the treatment adherence literature, half of it was just opinion and half of it were real studies. But what it tended to show was the simpler the regimen, a single medication or pill per day, you could have 80–90% compliance pretty easily. As soon as you started to add an extra medication to that regimen, the rate started to go down. And whenever you're dealing with a complex treatment regimen like those for asthma or diabetes or sleep apnea, the literature tends to show it's 50% at best. So it's really no surprise that CPAP is one of the harder things to use on a nightly basis. And I think what when I summarized literature, what was really interesting was, what do you think the basic factors they were looking at? Do you think they were looking at behavior change or patient-related factors? Not really. They were looking at BMI. They were looking at age. They were looking at education, things you can't change. And so we tried to change what we looked at and approach it from a behavioral change perspective. So within sleep medicine, we call that behavioral sleep medicine, where we bring some of the psychological ideas on behavior change and how to do what's necessary and to bring that to bear. So that research has started, but it's almost like two worlds colliding, the behavioral change and then the medical. And medical tends to be more, what's the problem? Let's diagnose the problem. Let's suggest a fix. The behavioral aspect of it is then how do you do it over time? And so I think over the last 10 years, we've seen some good progress, but there's a lot more to be made.
Follow-on question is, where can you find some of those results or the behavior about successful behavior changes?
Yeah, I can forward you some. There's been some real good approaches within the sleep apnea literature, for example. And now with adding technology over the last few years, we're really able to do a lot more by combining psychological behavioral change approaches combined with technology. And so whether it's text messaging support, notification kinds of support, nudges, there's some really great stuff going on that can be helpful.
And let me add just one thing. I always think about engagement, and it's not really about the research and the stuff that Carl is speaking about, but it's kind of just a thought about engagement. It takes two to engage, right? It takes at least two, and I think both parties have to have something to gain. And so, if for us to succeed in engaging, for patients to succeed in engaging with researchers, and particularly researchers to succeed in engaging with patients, is that we really have to find what's in it for them, right? So what's in it for patients to participate? And some folks may be dealing with a crisis, they can't sleep, or they have a cancer diagnosis that scares them. They're fighting for their lives or the lives of loved ones. Or there are other reasons as to there should be something to be gained. And so I think that's kind of key for engagement to work.
And it can't be forced engagement. It's as you said, it takes two to tango. We like to say we like to date before we get engaged, because there's no reason you can't go check out a few different doctors or get a few different opinions. You'd be probably better off doing that. So you might be more informed, and you might have too much information, but at least you have the information, and you have to learn to decipher it. So
I'll give you guys an example of some of the issues that come up on this topic. One is usually the research studies are kind of on the side at an academic medical center or at a large healthcare system. And so you have research groups that are doing what they do, and they just try any way at all to get the word out about their research studies. Now there's this phrase called the learning healthcare system. So if now, for example, UCSD takes this approach of saying, hey, we're a learning healthcare system. We want to incorporate what we learn from clinical practice and from research together, and it becomes an ethos, a way of going about it. Now there's a better understanding about why research is important to that institution, for example. And the reason why I bring it up is because we did an email to several thousand people a couple of years ago, research emails asking for research participation, and they were cold emails, so they had never received research emails before, and the vast majority of them went unresponded. We got complaints about them. People were unhappy with the topic. They were unhappy with the wording. And so if it takes two to tango, the healthcare system really needs to say, hey, we're a learning healthcare system. Help us in this mission. And here's why it's important. And that message, I think, is really just starting to begin.
Yeah, I saw Elizabeth had asked a question in here about what tips might we give to patients participating in low risk research study. I used to think that if I walked into a hospital, I assumed that learning healthcare system was, I'm the beneficiary of the people that walked through those doors before me. It was a real eye opener to me that that's not necessarily the case anymore. And that's, for me, it's, I assume, I'm hoping they're learning from me that I'm the beneficiary of the science and the research that's gone on for the lifetime and generations before us all, that I hopefully what we're doing will help to benefit someone else down the road, or maybe today, or maybe a generation from tomorrow. But if you're not putting something into my skin, or you're not, and there's not a drug or a surgical intervention, I invite people to participate. I mean, I know that research has had a terrible history in this country, but I think the advent of the technology has sort of broken down a lot of those barriers where the research only used to be done in clinic and in lab and in that more sterile environment where it is controlled and it's good for the science. But embracing this technology and this mobile technology that we have and all this data that we as patients are gathering with consumer data every day, with medical grade data, with self-reported data, just what we're all learning about ourselves is it would be a shame if the world wasn't learning from this stuff. I think we saw in light of the Cambridge Analytica, we see what could happen when the information is used in the wrong hands. And I think you could also imagine if that technology and that capability was put into good hands, what we might be able to really do in the research going forward and really start to move the ball on a lot of these diseases. As Hugo said earlier, if someone shows up with dementia, we get a lot of dementia people plugging around in our sleep apnea world because they're starting to connect the dots that there's a sleep component to what's going on with the prevention. It's great we're spending billions of dollars looking for a cure, but we could be doing a lot for prevention right now, and that would be one part, looking at people's sleep, for example. So.
No, and when it comes to the institutional, like Gil's comment here, if there's an institutional commitment to being a learning healthcare system and research, instead of me, an individual researcher, trying to get parking covered by the institution because my research dollars are limited, if the institution says, hey, this is just what we do, we cover the cost of parking, and there's $10 savings, that's a step in the right direction. But to go to Elizabeth's question about participating in low risk for the first time, there's just a couple of things. One is to just ask questions. There's what's called an informed consent process. So participation in research is always voluntary, and you should always be informed. So you should always have an understanding about what it is that's going to be done, how it's going to be done. And you should always feel free to ask as many questions as you would like to learn as much as you can before participation. And what she actually means by low risk is usually something where it's probably questionnaire based and the potential for harm or adverse events is low. Something that might be higher risk might be, you know, an experimental device or an experimental medication therapy, for example, where the harms maybe aren't known and they have to be monitored over time. That might be considered a higher risk study, in which case more questions should be asked.
You guys want to keep going through these questions?
Yeah, pick one.
I'll go back up to what Gil said earlier, we were talking about the reimbursement conversation as my cat chimes in. You guys talked about the parking, we talked about the low risk. Gil's asked, why might I choose to participate in research? What do you mean by participation? Passive participation as being a subject in a trial, or active participation as in helping to create better, more patient-centered protocols? I would say, Gil, the answer to that is all of it. We got to get people into the trials. We got to get people helping design the trials. We got to get more diversity into these trials so that we know what we're looking at a broader swath. I'm sure I'm not saying this right scientifically, Carl, but
no, you're exactly right. I mean, the scope in the beginning was actual participation in a research study, but clearly with the level of interactions and roles you guys have had, it's a natural to talk about active participation in general. So being involved with the research project from beginning to end is I think what he's getting at, and quite frankly, you know, that's why we emphasize how to slide on PCORI, because without PCORI, I don't think many patients and other key stakeholders would have a role. I mean, they've really forged new ground, I think, in terms of showing how important it is to have that role. I can honestly say that I've always done what I've considered applied clinical research, where I hoped it would have an effect on clinical practice. But until working side by side with these guys, you know, the urgency and the relevance, I think, is at a level that it would never have been if I wasn't working side by side from beginning to end. And I think every research study would benefit. So I hope it only expands. That would be the goal. As we've seen, though, not all research teams are accommodating or knowledgeable or even aware of the benefits. So I think we're at the beginning stages of that.
Another question come in from Teresa. Do you always have to have a certain medical condition to get into research, or can healthy people still participate?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of medical research is focused on a specific condition, but they're always also looking for healthy volunteers. Sometimes they advertise directly, and then sometimes they don't. But research can be pretty broad-based, so you just look for the advertisements and see how they're written, and then call up the research team directly and find out.
You know, a great research that is opening up just now is the All of Us, is the national program for precision medicine, in which is about recruiting 1 million Americans or residents of the U.S. in participate, and these are healthy folks, or anybody, and really, and healthy or not, it doesn't matter. The goal is to recruit a diverse cohort of participants, folks from every background and every age, And so that's I think it hasn't opened yet. It opened, like I said, poorly, explained very poorly at the beginning of this webinar. It opens this Sunday, May 6th, for enrollment all over the U.S. And joinallofus.org, if I can plug it. It's an NIH.
Yeah, absolutely. We're big supporters of that, and as I've told the people involved with it, what is the one thing a million people have in common? We all sleep. So we hope to see the sleep component looked at, and because I think it's a big public health issue for us, for healthy and for the sleep disorder communities that are overlapping with so many of these different comorbidities. Because the last I looked, everyone sleeps.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I was going to add, I'd like to say that I think we're on kind of an inflection point in research where the patient is more empowered than ever and wants to be more empowered, even potentially in the driver's seat. So I'd like to encourage all patients to continue to push that, because I think using an analogy again about software development, if you don't have a user involved, then you don't get very good software. So the patient community is the user, and we need and want, and I think we'll all benefit greatly by the urgency that patients have, and the curiosity that they have, and the energy that they have. So I think this is an interesting time in research, and it's of course the community can push on that and make it even better.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we doing on time? So, any other questions?
There's still some questions in the Q&A here and on the webinar chat as well.
Okay, I can take the next one.
So Robin asked, not sure if there's a general answer to this, but what is the typical sample size of patient studies on sleep apnea? Are there enough subjects to identify differences by gender, age, etc., in a statistically significant way? I will leave that to our doctor on the panel.
In general, no, they're not large enough, but there are a few epidemiologic studies that start to get at that. It does take quite a bit of funding and quite a bit of effort to have studies of the size that we want. I'm always disappointed in looking to the medical literature and seeing studies on 10 and 15 and 30 and 45 people, and we probably need in the thousands. But that's why the ASA is really talking about doing something like this and getting our own registry going where we can have the size to help answer some of those questions. Great question, though.
Great question, Robin. Elizabeth asked, as a patient participating in research, do you think you are then helping change the research landscape? Any examples of when you have helped enlightened a researcher? I was reading that. People like Hugo helping encourage researchers to take a second look at reimbursement standards or researcher accountability. I could say for myself, in the last 4 or 5 years, I think I used to feel felt like we were normally the tokens in the room, the token patients, so to speak. Not to use the most PC word, but I feel like as we've grown and as the advent of PCORI, and as you've heard the word patient-centered and patient engagement, I think we're starting to really be develop what the depth of that means and what it really is, and not just have it on paper, and make it really account for something, so that when someone says patient-centered, it's not that the patient's necessarily in the middle of it, it's that the patient's a part of the journey from beginning to end, no matter what it is we're discussing, or intervention or policy or drug. So that's I think we've been a beneficiary of it, but the way the world is right now, with technology changing and the political climate's changing, it'll be hard to say what the long-term ramifications of this are going to be.
Yeah,
Hugo might have a different take.
No. I agree. I also think it's important for participants in research to realize that we should be more active and help really continue kind of pushing to change the landscape. And we all hold a little bit of responsibility for that. And so I think it's it's important for us to not just be passive participants, but also provide feedback, engage, provide ideas, look for ways, meaningful ways.
It sort of starts as a progression. You know, you start off, you're not well, you start to get help, you complain, you whine, you go into your forums, you look at your support groups. And then at a certain point, you get yourself well enough to say, okay, we can keep whining about this and having the same conversation over and over, or we can start to do something and see if we can improve upon it, or at least do something different than doing what we've been doing, which is the definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. So I think that has been a really, really, really big sort of evolution for me personally. And it really, I could track it with a parallel path. As I got better, I stopped whining or complaining about it, and I can now identify it and complain and whine about it. But now we can offer practical, realistic, or potential different routes to go and try to improve upon whatever it is that we're not happy with.
I would say one of the biggest steps forward is on some of our grants. I mean, you guys are actually named as patient co-investigators, so you have actual titles, you know, so an active role, and I don't think those existed 7 years ago, for example, which shows that at least there's been some change. How far ranging it'll be going forward is time will tell. I think we got to get the stories out there about the benefits, and I think Corey's tried, but I think we need to do that more.
I think they've been a good stepping stone, but I think we have a long way to go still. And I think what the work that Hugo's doing with all of us and some of the other initiatives that are going on nationally or around the world I think the doors are being broken down, but it's still an archaic system for the most part.
Yeah.
So we have two last questions, and maybe we can click those off really quickly.
Okay.
Judy asked a question about access to CPAP machines, difficulty with insurance companies paying. And I would encourage Judy to go to the American Sleep Apnea Association website and check out a program that we have called the CPAP Assistance Program, where for a very nominal fee, you can get a complete system. And then Teresa asked the question from the ASAA's live feedback feed. I guess that's coming. How long does it take before your research changes the way doctors interact with me?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say
my wife might have asked that. I'm just saying.
In general, it has the potential to take quite a bit of time, but there's also the potential for it to happen relatively quickly. And what I would say is when there's negative research, when there's a harm or an adverse event, then I think we see practice change pretty quickly. I think in general, you can think of the practice of medicine as something that sometimes is slow to change, and sometimes there's benefits to the slow change, and sometimes it's frustrating to see how slow the change can be. So I think it's a wide range on what your guys' thoughts are.
The harder we push, the sooner it might come, and that's probably a good place to wrap. Which is the patient community involvement is super critical. Involvement in research has really good outcomes. The more we're involved, the quicker we can get to the right answers, and the quicker we can help larger groups of people that aren't in the same space as being able to do research at the moment. And they can become researchers down the path, and then we can accelerate this cycle.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Okay.
I was going to say and pay homage to John Walsh, the founder of the COPD Foundation, you know, and put it sort of in English terms for our patients. And, you know, he used to really poignantly say that is, if you're not at the table, then you're usually wind up on the menu. And we've been on the menu for most of our lives. And for right or wrong, that was just the way medicine was practiced. That was the way the hierarchy was set up. But with these chronic diseases and with the amount of different things that we're managing, and with as few little times that we have in the clinical environment, it's just really important that we are at the table. We don't have to be the chefs. We don't have to be the wait staff. But you know, we need to be at the table and having the conversation and participating in the meal from the beginning to the end.
And the best way to do that is participate in research.
Yeah.
Okay.
90% is showing up. Hugo, do you have any words of wisdom?
I don't know. I think it's important to engage in everything. So research is important, and we only have a limited amount of time and bandwidth to engage as much. So we really have to pick our battles. But I think I think it's important, particularly for people who are living with a chronic condition, who need to be managed. They should definitely engage in research. I think there's great benefits for all of us sometimes in the short term, but in the long term. So I think it's important. That's how I engage all the time. So.
Thank you for engaging with us today, Hugo.
And thank you for the participants engaging with us in our webinar. I think it's about time for us to wrap up. Thank you. Any last thoughts, Carl?
Oh, I was going to say, I not only do research, but I mean, it's so important. Each of my family members take part in a couple of research projects each year, and we even had a baby in the neonatal intensive care unit and had him participate in a research study. So it's just part of what we do, and I feel like it's one way to give back. So if folks who are listening have the ability to, it'd be great, and I hope we can encourage you to give it a try and see how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. 90% is showing up, and with that, I think we'll be signing off.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.